Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. The Supreme Court of Pakistan has ordered the Election Commission of Pakistan to hold the Punjab Assembly polls on 14th of May. A three-member bench headed by Chief Justice of Pakistan, Mr. Justice Umar Ata Bandial, also declared the decision of the Election Commission of Pakistan as unconstitutional of the postponement of Punjab Assembly elections till October the 8th. The court has also directed at the same time the federal government to release the election funds of 21 billion rupees to the Election Commission of Pakistan by April the 10th, and also saying that the federal government should provide a security plan by April the 17th to the Election Commission of Pakistan. The Supreme Court at the same time instructed caretaker government in Punjab to provide the ECP with a security plan by April the 10th also. Now, the federal cabinet has rejected this verdict by the Supreme Court of Pakistan, with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif correlating today, 4th of April, to the judicial murder of the former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and also saying on this very day, today, there has been murder of law and justice in the country by this particular verdict. Law Minister Azam Nazir Tarid has said that this particular decision is going to aggravate the current political situation in the country, and he has also said that the Supreme Court should have made a decision with a collective wisdom. We've also seen Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah saying that the elections should be held in the country simultaneously. We've also, a short while ago, heard a former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, the Supremo of PMLN, saying that such type of verdicts will lead to the devaluation of Pakistani rupee to 500 per greenback. What sort of impact this particular verdict by the Apex Court of Pakistan is going to have on the political and the economic situation in the country, and what sort of options the current government has against this particular decision? And to talk more about this, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Barrister Yasir Hamdani. He is legal expert. Mr. Hamdani, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And we are also honored to have been joined by Mr. Aniq Zafar. He is political analyst. Mr. Zafar, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And on Skype at the same time, we are being joined by Mr. Parvez Jamil Mead. He is senior journalist. Mr. Mead, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin the discussion with you, Barrister Hamdani. Now, when the law minister says that the Supreme Court should have given the decision with a collective wisdom, what's your take regarding this particular thing of collective wisdom on such important cases?
I believe that with respect to what's happened in terms of the decision, given that there was, there was a threat of boycott to begin with by the government, I think that it was, in my opinion, and I say this with trepidation, that perhaps the Supreme Court should have gone for a larger bench. I mean, there is the question of 4-3 versus 3-2 has not been resolved. Therefore, it had to be resolved first, and it had to be resolved by a bench that had the confidence of everyone involved. And I think a full bench, a 15-member bench, because there are 15 judges at the moment, not 17, 15 judges could have decided and could have come up with a decision on 4-3 that would have been acceptable to all. So I think the collective wisdom was very necessary, but the whole idea of collective wisdom was defeated when they decided to go with a 3-member bench that unfortunately had judges that, for good reasons or for bad reasons, the government or the ruling coalition had problems with. So I think that was a massive, I mean, again, I say this with trepidation. I think that this is going to be another day that's going to live in infamy in our history.
Right. Mr. Aniq Zafar, your understanding of this particular thing of collective wisdom, as the law minister says the Supreme Court should have gone with collective wisdom on this important matter.
I totally agree with Barrister Hamdani here that perhaps at this stage, when this critical question was being discussed and there was an apparent split between the judges in the Supreme Court, and we had been hearing in the past that there were differences between brother judges, but this time those differences had really come out in the open quite clearly and starkly, to the extent that judges are refusing to recognize other judges' judgments, verdicts, and saying that those verdicts do not matter. This bench we are talking about started with a 5-member bench. Two members decided to recuse themselves because of another development on the side, and it was left with only 3 judges. Government had no trust. So right now the decision making at the Supreme Court in terms of internal mechanism or administrative matters, or how the bench should be constituted, what is exactly the power of the Chief Justice and what is exactly not the power of the Chief Justice. Beyond that, the question was of a very large political and constitutional impact on Pakistan. So it would have been better if collective wisdom had been sought, and brother judges should have been involved in resolving this issue. Instead, what we have seen is that what to talk of a larger bench or a full bench, we hear that even a full court meeting could not be held, internal meeting of the judges could not be held. So in those circumstances, I think what this verdict has done, I had predicted here in this studio a few days back that the decision will be for the elections, but that is not going to resolve any issues. That is not going to resolve the political and constitutional logjam we are in.
Right, Mr. Amir, what's your take regarding this particular idea of collective wisdom? The Supreme Court should have given this particular decision or the verdicts based on collective wisdom, as the law minister says.
Look, there are 2 or 3 things. One, a country cannot run, no country in the world can run rudderless. You need an electorate, you need, somebody to be running it on a permanent basis. What we have right now in Punjab and of course KPK are interim governments. They cannot take decisions. They cannot continue forever and for an unknown period. And that is not good for the economy. That is not good for the security. That is not for the state. Whoever controls Punjab, whoever runs Punjab, runs Pakistan. Now, as far as the judgment is concerned, I've always maintained that when there's an air crash in Pakistan or any mishap, the whole country becomes, experts on aviation. There's a pandemic, the whole country becomes doctor. There's an economic crisis, the whole country becomes economists. Today, the whole country is becoming lawyers. Look, we are citizens of Pakistan and we have to respect our law, no matter who it is. Wrong or right, if there's something wrong, amend it in the parliament, as perhaps the bill would have passed. They should have done it a long time ago. But now that bill stands, and whatever the Chief Justice does, we have to respect it. Now, if you're going to go on the war path of, taking on the judiciary, one or the other, well, that's not good and healthy for the country. The judges, no matter who the judge is, we have to see them with one eye, not with 2 eyes. Because what happens is we have antagonized the judges. We have, the language which is being used for the judges, as previously the language was being used for the army chief, and of course for the army. Now that has stopped because the army has gone back. So now the next target for the politicians is the judiciary. Why cannot we not accept it? Why do we need 15 people rather than 3 or 4 people who are equally as honorable as the rest of the 15? I'll tell you why. Because people have lost their faith, their trust in our judiciary system. And who's that? The politicians. And of course, to an extent, people, because we've got about 50 to 55 years old cases still pending in the top courts. Now, somebody's got to be held responsible for that. So for a variety of reasons, this has been played upon. It is being played upon in the political arenas, which I don't think is the right way and the right approach. Elections have to be held, and what the Supreme Court has done exactly what the Constitution says. 90 days, well, we already, they should have been on the 18th of April, then they went on to the 30th, and now on the 14th. But elections have to be held, and what has been decided, whether we like it or not, it has been done constitutionally.
So, but the reason which was already being said by the authorities in the government is also the Election Commission of Pakistan, and there was a report that was submitted by the Ministry of Defense also explaining the reasoning behind the refusal of army to provide security for the polls also. So, I mean, there are certain substantial reasons the government authorities are saying, and the kind of economic difficulties Pakistan is faced with right now. So, amid these particular difficult conditions, don't you think these elements and factors should have been considered by the Honorable Supreme Court before giving a verdict like this?
I'm sure all situations and all events must have been under consideration by the courts. But at the end of the day, elections determine the future of the country. They determine the future of the people of the country. Look at Turkey, over 55,000 people dead. They're still holding elections. Don't you think they would be facing all kinds of security and other problems? Of course they will. The question is, why can't we do it? But let me tell you one thing.
So why, Mr.
Election,
why can't the elections in the center and in the provincial assemblies, as the practice traditionally has been most of the times in Pakistan, to be held concurrently? So there is the process of census also going on the basis of which new delimitations will be taking place. And if the elections in Punjab and KP happen before that of the center, so they are going to be based on two different premises, one before the census results and before the new delimitations, and the other one after those.
Well, today the situation is entirely different. I totally agree with you. Yes, they should all be held together. But no government in the world holds their national elections when they're on a downer. Let's accept it. We are on a downer. And it's no fault of this government. It's an international, recession. And we've already, seen that the amount of debt we are in, all we're doing is debt servicing. We're not putting anything back into the people because we can't. So there are lots of factors. And like I said, no government will hold elections if they're on a downer because they won't get any votes. And this is a political survival for them as well. So you've got to look at both the sides.
Mr. Mir, I seek your pardon for the interruption. Let me proceed with the discussion. Barrister Hamdani, now what sort of options, the legal options, do you think the government authority has, as the PMLN Supremo has also suggested to take this particular verdict to the Supreme Judicial Council also? Is there any option of that sort also?
Well, there is always the nuclear option, which is to go and file a reference against the judges. That's one. But there are other things that could be done. So, for example, the government can at this time say we're going along with it, we're going to hold the elections, but by, I would imagine by April 24th or so, the legislation that the Senate passed, the legislation regarding the right to appeal on 1843 of the Constitution, that legislation would automatically become law, and then there would be a right of appeal that would be available. Now the government can then go and appeal that.
Is it going to work in retrospective?
It would, yes, because of the amendment that was brought about by Mr. Mohsin Dawar. It is going to be the appeal is going to be valid for this particular case as well. So that's one. And if, say, for example, then that law gets challenged before the Supreme Court, then that itself delays the entire matter.
I'll take your detailed view regarding this particular thing. Mr. Aniq Zafar, now as the Law Minister says, the current political crisis is going to aggravate. What's your understanding of this whole scenario, the polarization we have already seen, the kind of political agitation and the confrontational politics that was going on? Is it really going to aggravate? What's your understanding of that?
That's written on the wall now, that constitutional and political crisis is going to aggravate before it settles somewhere maybe in May or June or wherever. The key problem here is that the Chief Justice, the Honorable Chief Justice of Pakistan, also tried to steer the stakeholders towards that. The problem is that the political stakeholders are not engaged with each other. Normally, under such circumstances, there is always some sort of backdoor negotiations, through some interlocutors or somewhere, some process of negotiation engagement continues between warring political factions. But currently, we are passing through a stage where there is immense distrust between different stakeholders, and they are not ready to engage with each other. Every stakeholder thinks that it has got the other stakeholders by the scruff of its neck, and it's going to beat them blue. So they are not working to bring any consensus formula on the table. Until and unless that formula comes on the table and stakeholders realize that without that we cannot get out of this constitutional or political crisis. This is very apparent. But the problem is that whenever you take political questions to the court has to make a decision. That decision may suit one party and may not suit the other. And as Mr. Mir also pointed out, that given the lack of trust and the past history of Pakistan's courts, when they have obviously sometimes supported unconstitutional measures, etc., etc. So because of that lack of trust, there will always be people who will be questioning the motive of the court. That is why again and again we are stressing that perhaps this was the time that Honorable Chief Justice may have taken a different view, might have taken a different view, and should have gone for a collective wisdom approach instead of doubling down on his administrative powers.
So what sort of options do you think the stakeholders which are unhappy with this verdict have legally?
Oh, well, on the face of it, not much, very frankly. The only option that going forward, there are two options, as Yasir mentioned. The nuclear option, that is again a very, very dangerous path to tread. Then of course the legislation which is in the process of being formalized into a proper law, that will go through the President not sending back the bill. Then it is going to the Joint House.
I seek your pardon for the interruption over here. I have to take a quick break, and after we return from this break, I will resume the discussion from here. For that, stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Views on News. We are discussing an important decision by the Supreme Court of Pakistan regarding holding of polls in the Punjab Assembly. It has ordered the Election Commission of Pakistan to hold Punjab Assembly polls on 14th of May. We are joined in the studio by Barrister Yasir Hamdani, his legal expert, by Mr. Aniq, Zafar, his political analyst. On Skype, we are being joined by Mr. Parvez, Jamil, senior journalist. Before going on the break, Mr. Aniq, Zafar, you were giving your take regarding the legal options, the stakeholders which are unhappy with this verdict of the Supreme Court. Please go ahead.
As I said, that once the law comes in somewhere after 20th of April, then that law is also going to be challenged in the Supreme Court, definitely. Then again, there will be a question that a law which is trying to regulate the powers of the Chief Justice, should Chief Justice himself lead that bench, or that bench will be led by the second senior most judge, or if the Chief Justice decides to leave it to the second or third or fourth senior most judge and packs the court again like he did today, the bench of 6 members. So again, the question will revolve around Chief Justice's power, whether Parliament has the power to legislate in that affair or not. So again, it will be a long discussion. It will take us into May, maybe June, but the government will be saying that since the law is there, we are appealing and we are not moving towards elections because we are in an appeal against that verdict. This is one option. Second option, nuclear option, I will not like to discuss that. Perhaps Barrister Hamdani will be in a better position to discuss that.
Right, Barrister Hamdani, your take. Before going on the break, you were also giving your take regarding the options the unhappy stakeholders have got against this verdict.
Well, that was like we talked about what happens if the legislation passes. The legislation passes and then it gets challenged again, and then the matter goes back to the Supreme Court, and the question that Mr. Zafar has asked, would the Chief Justice then sit on in judgment on his own case basically, so, or would he recuse himself? If he recuses himself, then is he going to appoint the next senior puisne judge, who's Mr. Qazi Faiz Isa, Justice? Would he appoint him? And if he gets there, then it all gets very interesting. It's all up in the air, right? So that's, but what we do know for a fact, and this is something that I'm willing to sort of put myself out there and say, you are not going to have elections on 14th of May. That's going to be an impossibility.
So what about this particular government stance of the security related issues regarding conducting the elections earlier?
Well, the constitutional requirement that ECP has is to hold not just elections within 90 days, but also free and fair and impartial polls. And that would be impossible if you're going to have a security situation where your security forces are no longer available or are not available for whatever reason. So the concerns that the Defence Ministry has put forth, the concerns that the federal government is putting forth, are actually concerns that make a lot of sense. I mean, these are credible issues that have been raised. So I do believe that those issues will come into play and they are necessary, and it is constitutional. Let me just say this whole idea. Obviously, the elections should happen in 90 days, and that goes without saying. There are 2 opinions about it. However, suppose the elections were delayed for whatever reason. There is Article 254 of the Constitution that gives you the protective cover. So if there is, because it's not, people unfortunately when they look at our judicial history, we love to throw about terms like the doctrine of necessity. You know, the doctrine of necessity was misused in 1958, you know, but the doctrine of necessity remains. I'm going to say this, and I know it's not a very popular opinion, but doctrine of necessity is a valid legal doctrine that has been used again and again. In 1958, when our court decided to justify the coup of Mr. Ayub Khan, the general then, that was a mistake, and there have been subsequent mistakes in our history. However, that doesn't take away the doctrine as a valid legal doctrine. It is a valid legal doctrine to the extent that if there is a necessity that arises, you do somehow find a way by which you can actually govern the country as close as possible to the constitution. So that basically means that if you're going to have elections within 90 days, if you're not having them, at least have them free, fair and impartial. And that's that is the overriding objective. Overriding objective is not to have elections within a certain period of time, but to have free, fair and impartial polls. And that's not going to happen. It's not just, we're not even talking about the logistical difficulties that we have, but also you pointed it out. You spoke about the fact that there is the census issue, there is the delimitation of constituencies, the very fact that you're going to have, and for some weird reason, the whole election jurisprudence, as it were, or the election sort of provisions of the constitution, etc. We've come to this idea in this country that elections can only happen under neutral caretakers. Now, if that is the case, then you're going to have elections on one day, because you're not going to have neutral caretakers in power after the elections happen in Punjab on 14th of May, but the national elections happen, say, in October. So that is something that has to be reckoned with. And I honestly believe that, I'm no judge, and I don't, how the shoe pinches, those who wear the shoe is entirely different. But I would imagine these things should have been taken into consideration by the Supreme Court, and they would have had the bench been larger and even a full bench. And I think again goes back to that collective wisdom. It was not dealt with properly, I'm sorry to say, and I say this with utmost respect to the judges that decided this, but I disagree with the judgment.
Right. Let me proceed towards Mr. Parvez Jamil. Mr. Mir, what sort of political impact it would have, this particular verdict? What do you see? Because we have already seen too much political polarization in the society, the kind of politics of agitation and confrontation. As the law minister says, it is going to aggravate the political crisis in the country. Your understanding of the whole equation?
The whole equation basically on only one thing, and that is a deficit between everyone. The Chief Justice very nicely said, why don't you two sit down and read? But no, we are not even, sitting on that issue as well. Today, the crux of the whole issue, let me tell you, Jawad, this is an original petition by Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on the 7th of May 1978. And this is addressed to the Chief Justice Anwarul Haq and President of Pakistan. And let me just read it. This is historic. Sir, my appeal against the judgment of the Lahore High Court sentencing me to death and imprisonment is pending in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, of which you are the Chief Justice. I'm writing this application from the death cell of Kot Lakhpat Jail, Lahore, with a request which I consider to be preeminently legitimate and reasonable. I'm writing this application after anxious and careful thought. The request is a simple one. Please do not preside over the Supreme Court when my appeal comes up for hearing on 20th May 1978. And then he goes on and gives addition that I didn't promote you and, you resented the Constitution, Sixth Amendment, and so on and forth. And then, in the end, this is what still bothers me. I hope you can read this. This is a sign by condemned prisoners of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, which we mourn today. And all why? Because the court at that time didn't do justice to Mr. Bhutto. So today, what we need to do is we shouldn't just, grab the courts by the neck. I think what we need to do is reform. Look and reform by mutual consent, and of course by mutual understandings. But we're not doing that. This is the same law which we didn't touch, and now we are touching it. You disqualify a prime minister on what? An akama? Give me a break. The law comes in effect only for an akama. I mean, that's a joke. You hound a former prime minister for corruption and all that, but he's not convicted for corruption. He's convicted for akama. So what about the justice system? So what I'm trying to say is that the justice system has to be absolutely balanced. And that is what we need to do. All we're discussing right now is lacunas. He should have done that. Maybe they should have come in. And these are all, in my opinion, absolutely frivolous arguments. What we need to be doing is thinking long term for the state of the country, for state of Pakistan. And we need to, we need to strengthen our states. Look at us, as I mentioned before. Now the armed forces are back. They don't want to interfere. They say, get on with it, do what you like. So now they're out of the picture. Now we hit on the judiciary, whether it is A, B, or C. But that is what we are doing. And it is not the judiciary. We are hurting our own state organs. And that is the crux of the discussion. And the discussion has to be sane, honest, and meaningful for betterment of the country. We are not thinking on those lines, Jawad. And that is where we are losing out. We need to have common sense. We need to be talking with each other. No one party in this country can, or anywhere in the world, can just run the country like that. The countries are run together, not alone. We can't have lone rangers now. We've got to have a unified approach. What did our founder of the nation say? Three things: unity, faith, and discipline. Do we have that? No. We are fighting with each other. For what? For just to get into the corridors of power? Is that it? Is that the legacy we're going to leave behind, no matter who it is? We've got to be, these are crucial times. These are not good times for our country. And this is a time for unity. And this is something, I hope the top leadership in the country understands and, treads on the political path in a very, very judicious manner. And that is the way forward.
Right. Mr. Zafar, as Mr. Parvez Jamil has pointed out, mutual consent for the judicial reforms, so the justice is dispensed rightly. Your take regarding that?
Of course, there is no doubt that judicial reforms and all these kinds of reforms we have been talking about need to be undertaken. But the question is that what do we mean by mutual consent? The consent, one way of mutual consent or lawmaking is through the parliament. Whatever the parliament decides is considered the will of the nation. But here we have seen that parliament's powers are usurped sometimes by the judiciary. Judiciary tries to check the parliament whenever there is some legislation which impinges on their so-called independence. For example, they have this absolute control over nominations in the higher courts and in the Supreme Court. They have their absolute control over that. And in the 18th Amendment, it was tried that there should be a mechanism where the parliamentary committee plays an important role in those appointments. But Mr. Iftikhar Chaudhry threatened to overthrow the whole 18th Amendment if that is not amended again to his satisfaction. So if by mutual consent we mean that the Supreme Court, one Chief Justice, one individual can actually override the Parliament through sitting in the Supreme Court, then I mean what kind of consensus we are talking about? Do we need a grand national debate on these issues? Yes, we need a grand national debate on these issues, but again, the legislation will have to be done in the Parliament, and that we will have to agree that Parliament is the only forum that can legislate and Parliament is the supreme institution. That we will have to agree to. One point which I think while discussing this delay in elections which the government has been arguing, we have not really focused on the census issue. Now, if you go back to 2018, we must all remember that a census was held in 2017 and there were major objections by the provinces on that census. So the 2018 elections were held on sort of an assurance that a new census will be held. This census, which is now being undertaken, was agreed by the former Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, in the CCI meeting. So this census, which should have been held after 10 years, is being held after 7 years. Okay? 16 and 17, the last census was held. So this is very important because again, the lacuna which will be created through this will be that two provinces will be two provinces will have their provincial elections under the old census and old delimitation. Two provinces will have, or the National Assembly elections will be held under a different delimitation and census. So that will also create further problems going down the road. So to avoid those problems, we have to foresee those right now. That is called foresight. That is called warning
so for
of
that,
the situation.
Don't you think there should be a realization among those stakeholders who are consistently and continuously been calling for early elections?
That's very interesting. When I look at this demand now that the whole focus is on Punjab elections, less on KP, let's go back and see why were these two assemblies dissolved. What was the objective? The objective was not to hold elections in these two provinces. The stated objective was that we are doing this to pressure the government into holding a national election, right? So say on May 15th, election are held, May 14th in Punjab. What is the guarantee that to pressure the government again, that assembly will not be dissolved again?
That's a very interesting point that you just highlighted. I would like to go to Barrister Hamdani. Is there any sort of a provision? Of course, it becomes necessary, as per the Constitution, to hold elections within 90 days after the assembly is dissolved. But if such a scenario is created once again, and that very much in near future, as Mr. Aniq Zafar has mentioned, so is there any kind of constitutional or legal protection to make an assembly keep functioning till a certain period of time?
Well, I think that's something that needs to be, at this point, we need to bring that up in our constitution, because what's happened here with these two assemblies being dissolved, I mean, it's happened, I'm sorry to say, just because of the ego of one man. You've basically sacrificed these two assemblies, because there wasn't any other reason. And so this was actually a question that should have been taken up, or would be taken up had there been a fairer bench. They would have taken up the issue of whether the dissolution itself was fair and proper or not, or were there good constitutional reasons for it. At the moment, there isn't anything in the Constitution that stops such dissolution. However, one imagines that someone who's placed in that situation where he or she can call shots in terms of which assembly will be dissolved and which won't be dissolved, they would exercise some caution and be reasonable about it. And not just follow, in this mad pursuit of personal aggrandization. So I personally feel that, if this was an issue that could have been addressed earlier, and I think going forward, you're going to have to there has to be a constitutional amendment to allow for fixed tenures. I think in terms of assemblies losing or vote of confidence, no confidence, etc. You can have changes of government within the parliament, but you can have fixed terms for the parliament or the assemblies or the legislatures.
Well, that depends on the majority. We saw that former Prime Minister going out with the vote of no confidence, but yet the tenure of the assembly seems to be getting completed this time around in the centre. With different parties taking over the helm.
Exactly.
But with the majority in the provincial assemblies, they had that very power of dissolving those assemblies. So it's not perhaps about the tenure, it's some sort of bar that has to be made and some sort of legislation regarding that. Is there any chance or is there any option regarding such type of legislation?
I think ultimately wisdom would suggest that you have to do this, that you have to come up. So for example, and I mean obviously we're not talking parliamentary democracy to parliamentary democracy, but when we talk about the US, the elections are going to happen every 4 years, every 2 years actually, on November 8th, or I think it's the first Monday or something like that.
Yeah, first Tuesday after the first Monday.
Yeah, first, so that's, if you follow that, have something of that sort, there would be a certain amount of certainty to the assembly's tenure. So I think that this wisdom would dictate that yes, we should have, ultimately we should evolve a system where we know the election dates 4 years in advance, 5 years in advance. So I think that would be I think ultimately going forward the parties would have to come to such a consensus, because what we've seen happening is with this dissolution has been just an abuse of process, and that's something that needs to be stopped going forward.
Right, Barrister Hamdani, last week we saw that the coalition government in a joint statement also said that they expressed complete distrust in the three-member bench today, which has given this verdict. If such sort of reservation by a certain stakeholder is expressed explicitly, does it come under consideration in the Supreme Court before giving a verdict?
Well, I would have imagined that judges, as being reasonable, cautious individuals, which they are supposed to be, men of great sort of probity, they would have taken that into account, because what we have right now is a standoff. Right now, if the government says we are not going to, we are just going to defy the verdict, we are not going to accept the verdict, which they have today, the federal cabinet has said that, then what happens next? Will the Supreme Court then go ahead and have a contempt notice against the entire federal government, and will they, all of them, be disqualified? Now that's, and if there is such a disqualification, who's going to implement that? So you're going to have a situation where you're turning institution upon institution, essentially. So I think that should have been a consideration. That's why, you know, we have these judges who come in, you know, after 30 odd years of experience. You know, one would imagine that they would be, you know, sort of should take into consideration all of these issues. So unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have happened in this case.
Barrister Yasir Hamdani, legal expert, thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate your precious time. And Mr. Aniq Zafar, political analyst. Mr. Zafar, thank you very much for your time also for being with us. And on Skype, we were joined by Parvez, Jamil, me, senior journalist. Mr. Me, thank you very much for your time also for being with us. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.